Welcome to module 2. In the last module, we talked about confusion, how emotionally unhealthy relationships slowly disconnect people from their instincts, their emotional grounding, and their sense of clarity. Now, in this module, we're going to talk about one of the biggest reasons people stay emotionally trapped even after they begin recognizing unhealthy patterns. Hope. More specifically, attachment to potential. Because many survivors are not only emotionally attached to who the person is, they are emotionally attached to who the person keeps promising they could become. And that distinction matters. This is where many people become trapped inside emotional contradiction. Because the relationship may repeatedly create confusion, instability, pain, self-doubt, and emotional exhaustion. But every once in a while, there's a conversation, an apology, a breakthrough moment, a temporary emotional closeness. And suddenly hope returns. The relationship feels different again. For a moment, it feels like maybe things are finally changing. And that cycle keeps many people emotionally attached for longer than they expected. That's why one of the core philosophies of this decoder system is this: patterns matter more than promises, not temporary emotional moments, not future potential, not isolated apologies, patterns. Repeated behavior reveals emotional reality. Now, let's slow this down for a second. Because many emotionally unhealthy relationships do not survive through emotional stability. They survive through inconsistency. That's important. If a relationship felt painful all the time, most people would eventually leave. But emotionally unhealthy dynamics often alternate between pain and relief, distance and closeness, coldness and affection, confusion and reassurance. That inconsistency creates emotional attachment in powerful ways, especially when someone is emotionally invested in the relationship working. And over time, many survivors begin focusing more on emotional possibility than emotional reality. They begin asking, who could this person become? Instead of asking, who are they consistently showing themselves to be? See, that question right there changes everything. Because many people stay emotionally trapped waiting for potential change, potential healing, potential consistency, potential emotional maturity, potential accountability, potential closeness. But potential is not the same as patterns. And emotional unhealthy relationships often survive through the promise of future improvement. This is where something called future faking becomes important. Future faking happens when promises of future change become part of the emotional cycle, part of the cycle without consistent behavioral follow through. For example, we're going to be better soon. I know I hurt you, but things are going to change. Once life calms down, everything will be different. I promise I'll communicate better. will finally have the relationship you deserve. Now, let me be clear. Not every promise is manipulation. People can genuinely want to improve. People can struggle emotionally. People can make mistakes. But the decoder focuses on repeated patterns, because repeated promises without repeated behavioral change create emotional instability over time. And many survivors become emotionally attached to the hope of who someone could become, while ignoring who they constantly are. That creates emotional conflict, especially when moments of closeness temporarily reactivate hope. This is where intermittent reinforcement becomes extremely powerful. Intermittent reinforcement means affection, attention, emotional closeness, or reassurance becomes unpredictable. And unpredictability creates emotional dependency. One moment distance, the next moment deep affection. One moment silence, the next moment emotional intensity. One moment emotional withdrawal, the next moment love bombing, closeness, reassurance, or emotional vulnerability. That unpredictability trains the nervous system to chase relief, not peace. Relief. And again, that distinction matters, because peace feels emotionally stable. Relief feels temporary. Peace creates grounding. Relief creates craving. And many survivors become emotionally addicted to temporary emotional relief after periods of emotional instability. That cycle can become incredibly powerful psychologically, especially when someone believes, if I just hold on a little longer, maybe things will finally become what they were supposed to be. But here's something very important I need you to hear. A relationship cannot survive long-term on emotional potential alone. Eventually, emotional reality always reveals itself through repeated behavior. Not words, not promises, not emotional speeches, behavior, patterns, consistency. That's why many survivors eventually realize something painful. They were not in love with emotional stability. They were emotionally attached to intermittent emotional relief. And those are not the same thing. Now, let's talk about apology cycles for a moment. Many emotionally unhealthy relationships follow repetitive cycles. Hurt, conflict, apology, temporary closeness, then repeated behavior. Over and over and over again. And because the apology temporarily creates emotional relief, many survivors interpret the apology as proof of meaningful change. But let me tell you something. Apologies without behavioral consistency eventually become part of the instability cycle. That's important, because emotionally healthy accountability does not only sound sincere, it becomes visible through repeated behavioral change. Consistency matters. And many survivors stay emotionally trapped because they confuse emotional intensity with emotional transformation. Someone crying, begging, promising, or expressing regret does not automatically mean emotional patterns have changed. Again, patterns matter more than promises. Now, Another dangerous thing that happens inside emotionally unhealthy relationships is emotional memory distortion. Many survivors begin remembering the relationship primarily through emotional highs. The good moments, the closeness, the chemistry, the emotional intensity. And slowly, the brain minimizes the instability, the confusion, the exhaustion, the actual emotional pain. That's one of the reasons radical acceptance becomes so very important, because radical acceptance asks, what is repeatedly happening? Not what do I wish would happen? That distinction is powerful and difficult, because many people are grieving two relationships at the very same time. The relationship that they actually experience and the relationship they hoped it would eventually become. And often the grief attached to lost potential is what keeps people emotionally stuck. Now, let me say something clearly here. This module is not about encouraging hopelessness. It's not about teaching people to give up on others. People absolutely can grow. People can heal. People can change. But healthy change requires consistency. It requires accountability. It requires self-awareness and sustained behavioral effort, not repeated emotional promises alone. And if someone repeatedly creates emotional instability while repeatedly promising future change, that deserves honest observation, not emotional denial, not endless rationalization, freaking observation. Now, here's a very powerful question I want you to sit with. If you removed all promises from the relationship and only evaluated repeated behavior, what emotional reality would remain? And that question changes everything. Because many survivors stay emotionally attached to words while their nervous system is reacting to patterns. And your nervous system often recognizes emotional instability way long before your mind fully accepts it. That's why emotional exhaustion matters. That's why confusion matters. That's why chronic anxiety inside relationships matters. Your body is often responding to repeated emotional inconsistency. Now, before we close this module, I want you to remember something very, very important. You do not need to hate someone to recognize repeated instability. You do not need to destroy someone in order to protect your peace. And you definitely do not need to keep sacrificing your emotional stability in order to remain loyal to someone's potential. Because emotional reality eventually reveals itself through patterns, not promises. And in the next module, we're going to begin decoding some of the most common emotionally destabilizing communication patterns that create confusion inside unhealthy relationship dynamics. Gaslighting, blame shifting, invalidation, emotional reversal, and the hidden dynamics beneath emotionally manipulative communication. Let's continue decoding these patterns together.